The cart stood in the middle of the Harwick County Fairground, and every person within 50 feet of it knew that something had shifted in the order of things. It was the third Saturday of October, the sky the color of a hammered tin cup, and the line of people waiting to buy from Clara Vesper stretched past the livestock pens and doubled back along the fence like a river that had forgotten where it meant to go. Clara herself stood at the head of it with both hands resting on the edge of her table, quiet in the way a stone is quiet, unhurried in the way a stone is unhurried, looking out at the crowd with an expression that gave nothing away and asked for nothing in return. And there, at the edge of the fairground, stood Denton Marsh, the man who had controlled the buying price of every bushel of fruit in that county for 11 years. And the look on his face was the look of a man watching a fire he had been absolutely certain would never catch. His jaw worked slowly. His hands were opening and closing at his sides. He had driven to that fairground, believing he was going to offer Clara Vesper a number low enough to remind her of her place, and he had arrived instead to find her place considerably higher than his own. Some people who were watching him watched the way you watch a dog that has just walked into a glass door. They were waiting to see what he did next. Clara was not watching him at all. She was counting. 3 years earlier, almost to the day, the same county had watched Clara Vesper hand over $4 for a full cartload of hail-split, bruised, split-skinned apples that any sensible person could see were fit for nothing, and had laughed at her the way people laugh when they are relieved it was not their money. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? The cart had belonged to old Franklin Greer, who ran 30 acres of heritage apple trees on the slope above Cutter's Creek, and who had, that September, been punished by a hailstorm so specific and so mean in its aim that a man might have suspected a personal grudge. The hailstones had come in the night, round and hard as rifle balls, and by morning 3/4 of his crop lay split and weeping on the ground, skin cracked open, flesh browning at the seams, the whole hillside perfumed with something between a cider house and a grief. Franklin Greer was 64 years old and not a weak man, but he stood at the edge of that orchard at first light and said nothing for a very long time. By afternoon he had loaded what he could onto his flatbed cart, covered it with a canvas that did not quite reach the corners, and pulled it into the lot behind the feed store in town, and he set the price at $4 for the load. He did not think anyone would take it. He set the price mostly so that the thing in his chest had somewhere to go. Clara Vesper appeared at the lot at 2:30 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, which was already an unusual thing because Clara Vesper on a Wednesday in September should by all rights have been at the canning cooperative her late husband Emmett had helped to found, the one that had grown politely indifferent to her since his funeral and had since reorganized itself around younger families with newer equipment and fewer opinions. She was 41 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches of practical bone, and she had been managing 22 acres of rocky bottomland alone for 2.5 years, growing enough to live and not quite enough to do more than that. She looked at Franklin Greer's cart for a long time. She walked around it once. She pressed her thumb into one of the split apples and held it to her nose and breathed. She did this with 3 more apples moving slowly, and then she stood still and did a calculation that no one watching could read from the outside. She had $19 and some cents to her name that day. This is not a figure invented for sympathy. It is the figure her account book recorded in her own careful handwriting on the page dated the 22nd of September. She paid Franklin Greer $4 for the cart and shook his hand and thanked him, and he looked at her the way a man looks at someone who has just done him a kindness he did not expect. She borrowed a neighbor's mule and a flatbed wagon and hauled the whole load back to her property that evening, and she covered it with burlap in the barn because the nights were already carrying a chill and she did not sleep especially well because the arithmetic kept running itself again and again through her mind without her permission. The $4 was not the whole calculation. The whole calculation was this: a bushel of clean, unbroken, market-grade apples sold that year in Harwick County at between 70 cents and $1.10, depending on variety, and who was doing the buying. And Denton Marsh was usually the one doing the buying, which meant the price was usually closer to 70 cents. Cider, pressed and bottled, sold for 40 cents a quart at the Harwick County Fair if the quality was ordinary, and 60 cents if it was not. Vinegar, properly aged, sold for more than that, and hail split apples, which could not be sold whole and which the cooperative would not accept, could still be pressed. They could still be excellent. The split skin meant nothing to a press. It meant nothing to fermentation. It meant, in fact, that the sugars had already begun concentrating in the exposed flesh, which was a thing that people who had never made cider in quantity tended not to know, and that people who had made it for 20 years knew very well. Clara Vesper had been making cider with her mother on a farm in the next county since she was 9 years old. The knowledge lived in her hands. She had no cider press. This was the first problem. The second problem was that the apples needed to be processed within the week, or the split fruit would spoil past usefulness. The third problem was that the town already regarded her with the particular fondness of people who are waiting for you to fail in an instructive way. There was a man named Aldous Piet, who lived on the neighboring property to the west, a compact man of perhaps 72, with a trimmed white beard and an accent that placed him somewhere far east of Pennsylvania, a place he never named with any precision, and who had been farming the same 12 acres of bottomland for so long that the county tax records had simply stopped questioning him. He kept bees. He also kept, under a canvas-covered lean-to at the back of his barn, a cider press that he had built himself from iron and white oak 30 years before, and used perhaps 4 times a year, and otherwise left to the silence and the mice. Clara had known about this press for years. She went to Aldous Piet the morning after she brought the hail-split apples home, and she asked him if she could borrow it. He was sitting on an upturned crate in front of his hives at the time, not doing anything in particular, watching the bees in the way he watched most things, which was as if they were telling him something true and unhurried. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said a thing she did not expect. He said, "The broken ones always carry the most." She waited to see if there was more. There was not. He nodded once toward the lean-to. She took that as a yes. This was the aphorism she carried for the next 3 years. She carried it the way you carry a tool, not always in your hand, but always within reach. The broken ones always carry the most. Aldous Piet had said it in the way a man states a thing he has observed over decades and no longer feels the need to argue. She did not argue. She took the press apart carefully, loaded it onto the wagon, and set it up in her barn between the second and third stalls, where there was room and where the smell of fermentation would be absorbed by the old wood rather than drifting to the road and announcing itself to the county before she was ready. She worked alone for the first 3 days. She sorted the apples into 3 categories: those split but sound, those split and browning but still sweet-fleshed when cut, and those gone too far for cider and good only for vinegar. She worked from before sunrise to after dark, and the barn smelled of late autumn, and bruised sweetness and damp wood, and her hands by the second evening were stained a dark amber at the creases of her knuckles that would not wash entirely away for the rest of the season. She kept a running count: 412 pounds in the first pile, 260 in the second, 93 in the third, which she set in their own covered crock with a gauze lid, and left to the long patience of acetobacter and time. 765 pounds of fruit in total from a $4 cart. She did this arithmetic, too, and wrote it down. On the 4th day, a child appeared. She was perhaps 8 years old, or possibly 9, small and serious, and smelling of wood smoke, and she arrived in Clara's dooryard without announcement and stood at the barn door watching with an expression of complete attention. Her name, eventually offered when asked, was Wren. She belonged to the Tadlock family who rented the old dairy house half a mile down the road, a family of 6 children and a father who worked 2 jobs and a mother who worked more than that, and Wren was the middle child in the way middle children sometimes are, self-sufficient, watchful, slightly elsewhere. She did not ask to help. She simply appeared and watched, and on the second morning of her watching, she began handing things to Clara without being asked, and by the end of that day she was turning the press handle on the downstroke while Clara fed the pomace and held the receiving bucket level. They did not talk much. Wren named the press. She called it the Mouth. The name stuck. Clara did not correct it. The Mouth worked all day and part of the night, and what came out of it was a cider so dense and golden and sharp with fermenting sugar that when Clara gave Wren a half cup to taste, the child held it in both hands and looked into it seriously, as if it were telling her something. Clara filled 7 2-gallon crocks in the first pressing and covered them with muslin weighted with smooth creek stones, and set them in the root cellar, where the temperature held at 54 degrees and would not fluctuate. She knew from long acquaintance with the process that rushed fermentation made rough cider and that the desire to hurry was the enemy of flavor. She had a customer for rough cider if she chose. Harwick County had several taverns that would buy bulk cider at 20 cents a gallon without asking many questions. She did not choose this. She wrote in her account book, 14 gallons, begun the 29th of September. Anticipated ready late November earliest. The handwriting was neither hopeful nor pessimistic. It was informational. October came in cold and honest, and the hills above Cutter's Creek turned the colors of embers. The cooperative sent out its annual price notice, which Clara received by mail, as she had every year since Emmett's death, though she had not sold through them in 2 seasons. The notice carried Denton Marsh's signature at the bottom, as it always did. He was not technically the director of the cooperative, but he was its largest buyer and its most reliable creditor, which amounted to the same thing in practice. The price he offered for a bushel of mixed heritage varieties this year was 68 cents. Clara read the notice and folded it in half and set it under the leg of the table that was shorter than the others, which was where she put paper she had read and did not need but was too practical to throw away. She had at this point no apples to sell him anyway. She had cider in a cellar and vinegar in a crock and the quiet of her own property, and these felt, if not like wealth, then like a position. The first frost came on the 7th of October, 3 days earlier than usual. It was followed the following week by a second, harder frost, and then by a week of thin, cold rain that turned the unpicked fruit on the trees of 3 farms east of Harwick into something between a mush and a disappointment. By the 3rd week of October, there were farmers who had lost a quarter of their sellable harvest to what the county paper called a compounded cold event, which was a phrase that translated, in practical terms, to the thing you did not bother to protect yourself against because it had not happened in recent memory has now happened. The farmers who had insured their crops against cold damage were doing arithmetic. The farmers who had not were doing different arithmetic. Clara's bottomland, being low and frost-prone in most years, had never supported an apple orchard in the first place, and she had never planted one, and so she had no crop to lose. She had instead 14 gallons of hard cider developing quietly in her root cellar and a crock of apple cider vinegar that was already, at 3 weeks, showing the cloudy ring of active culture that meant the Acetobacter were working. She went down to the cellar on the 21st of October, removed the muslin from one of the crocks, and tasted from a wooden spoon. She replaced the muslin and the creek stone, and went back upstairs and washed the spoon, and stood at the window for a moment, looking at the frost-flattened garden. Then she went to her account book and wrote, "Promising." She had not told anyone about the cider. This was a deliberate choice rather than an oversight. She was aware of what happened when a woman alone in a county like this one showed a success before it was complete. The men who had ignored you came around to advise, and the women who had pitied you came around to ask, and both attentions were a tax on your time and your concentration that you could not afford. The broken ones always carry the most, Aldous Piet had said, and she had added to this in her own mind a corollary that she had not said aloud to anyone. It is easier to believe a thing is ruined than to admit you were wrong to walk past it. She had watched the county walk past her property for 2.5 years. She understood this better than most, and she had concluded that being right was its own kind of reply, and that silence unnerved more than argument, and that she could afford to be quiet for a little longer. Denton Marsh came to see her in the first week of November. He arrived in his carriage on a Tuesday afternoon, which was not a social call day, and which meant the call was something other than social. He was a large man, not fat but spread, with a face arranged into an expression of permanent, mild approval that Clara had always found difficult to trust. He got down from the carriage and stood in her dooryard, and called out good afternoon in the voice he used when he was about to offer you something at a disadvantage. She came out onto the step and waited. He said he had heard she was experimenting with cider and wanted to let her know that he was in a position to offer her a fair price for bulk product if she found herself with more than she could sell retail, and that he had always admired her industry and was sorry the cooperative could not have been more accommodating to her particular situation. The particular situation was Emmett's death. He was using it as leverage now, 2.5 years after the fact, which told her everything she needed to know about how the conversation was meant to proceed. He named a price, 15 cents a gallon. She looked at him. She said, "I'll keep it in mind." He waited for more. She did not produce more. He left, and she went back inside, and she wrote in her account book, "Marsh, November 3rd, 15 cents per gallon." She did not write what she was thinking. She did not need to. By the first week of December, she had finished the pressing and the filtering and the racking, a process she performed with the same methodical patience with which she did everything, and the total yield from 412 pounds of split sound apples and 260 pounds of split browning apples was 31 gallons of hard cider at varying stages of development. 12 gallons she judged ready in the spring, 11 she judged ready in the summer, and 8 she judged exceptional and set apart in their own crocks labeled in her account book with the notation, "Do not rush these." She had borrowed Aldous Piet's press for the season and returned it cleaned and oiled better than she had received it. She had paid him nothing, because he had asked for nothing. She brought him instead the first quart she bottled, sealed with wax, and left it on his porch without a note. That evening there was a quart of honey from his bees on her own porch. They did not discuss this. It was an accounting of a different kind. The winter was long and specific in its meanness, which winters in that county sometimes were, as if making up for a mild autumn by arriving with accumulated grievances. The road to the Tadlock place iced over in January and stayed that way for 3 weeks, and Wren did not come by the barn during that time, but she appeared the day after the thaw with her boots muddy to the ankle, and her expression exactly as serious as it had always been, and she went straight to the root-cellar stairs and looked down into the dark and said, "Is the mouth done?" Clara said the mouth was done for the season and the cider was resting. Wren said, "Resting from what?" Clara said, "From becoming." Wren thought about this and then nodded, which was the response she reserved for things she had decided were true. Spring arrived in the county like a debt being paid, slow and grudging at first, and then all at once in the second week of April, and the apple trees on the farms above Cutter's Creek put out their blossoms with the particular insistence of trees that have survived a hard winter and are making a point. Franklin Greer's trees, the heritage varieties, bloomed densely and earlier than the newer grafted varieties, which had always been their way. A stubbornness that was also a kind of argument for their continued existence. Clara walked the property boundaries on the 16th of April, as she did every spring, and noted what was doing well, which was most things, and what was doing poorly, which were the creek bank willows, and what was doing neither, which was the silence along the fence line where Emmett used to walk of an evening. She noted this too, briefly, and then walked back to her work. She began selling the cider in May, quietly, not at the cooperative and not through Denton Marsh, but directly to the inn at the county seat, which had a dining room that prided itself on local provisions and which had been paying 40 cents a quart for a mediocre cider shipped from 3 counties over. To 2 families in town who kept a good table and who had heard through the oblique social routes by which information travels in a small county that Clara Vesper had something worth tasting. And to the general store in the township of Aldous, 7 miles east, whose proprietor, a practical woman named Hester Gund, had asked Clara directly in February what she had been doing all winter, and had received the only honest account Clara had given anyone, and who had said simply, "Bring me what you can spare, and I will sell it." The price Clara set at the general store was 55 cents a quart. The price at the inn was 60 cents. These were not greedy prices. They were accurate ones. By June, the 12 gallons she had judged ready in spring were gone, and the 11 she had judged ready in summer were half gone, and the word that had attached itself to her cider through the county's horizontal gossip network was not a loud word. It was a word passed from mouth to mouth in kitchens and on porches, the way truly good things travel, in a place where people are suspicious of announcement but cannot suppress a recommendation when the thing deserves it. The word was that it was something. People said, "Have you had Vesper's cider? It is something." They did not always say more than that, because more than that was harder to put into words. It was the particular quality of the cider that came from hail-split late-season fruit pressed in cold air and rested for months without hurry, a sharpness and a sweetness in tension with each other, a depth behind the first note, and something else that was harder to name, and that Aldous Piet, when he tasted it, named for her by saying only, "That is a cider that has been through something," which was, she thought, true enough. The summer grew and the cider sold, and she recorded every transaction in the account book, in the same careful handwriting that had recorded the original $4 purchase. And the numbers accumulating on the credit side of the page were, by August, sufficient to replace the account book's tone from informational to something she might, in private, have called provisional relief. She bought herself a new pair of work boots in July. She settled the outstanding account at the feed store. She paid 3 months ahead on the property tax, which she had not been able to do in 2 years. She did not discuss any of this. It is easier to believe a thing is ruined, she thought, than to admit you were wrong to mock it. She was not interested in correcting anyone's assumptions yet. She banked the success like a coal under ash, low and hot and patient. Denton Marsh came back in late July. He arrived unannounced again, which had become his pattern with her, as if the removal of social ceremony would catch her off guard and rearrange the negotiation in his favor. He knew about the inn. He knew about Hester Gund's store. He had not known about either of these things through honest intelligence. He was a man who made it his business to know prices in his county, and he had likely heard the number 60 cents somewhere, and the number 55, and he had performed a calculation that arrived at a conclusion he did not enjoy. He stood in her dooryard and said he had been thinking about her situation, and had revised his offer. He named a price, 28 cents a gallon. This was less than half what she was earning at the general store. He said it with the manner of a man doing a favor. She looked at him with the expression she had been practicing, without knowing she was practicing it, for 3 years, which was the expression of someone who has already made her calculation and is waiting for you to finish yours. She said, "That's a kind thought, Denton." He waited for the rest of it. She said, "I'm all right." He left again, and she watched his carriage go up the road, and she thought about the coal under the ash, and decided it was not yet time to uncover it. August turned to September, and September brought the kind of dry heat that concentrates flavor in ripening fruit, and shortens patience in people who have been managing uncertainty for too long. The 8 gallons she had set apart as exceptional were still in the root cellar, still covered with muslin and creek stones, and she tasted from them once a week, and each time returned the muslin to its place, and wrote 1 word or 2 in her account book. Not yet. The discipline of not yet was the hardest thing, not the labor which was extensive, and not the loneliness which was present, and not the arithmetic which was relentless, but the discipline of knowing something was ready to be known, and holding it back until the moment was right. She thought of Aldous Piet watching his bees, not doing anything in particular, waiting on a truth. She thought of the broken ones always carrying the most, and how the carrying was a long business, and how it required a specific kind of faith that was not optimism exactly, but was closer to a kind of structural refusal to stop. Wren came nearly every afternoon that September after her farm chores were done. She was 9 now, or perhaps 10, and she had learned the names of most of the processes without being taught them in any formal sense, simply by watching and handing and listening. She knew what racking meant, and what clearing meant, and what the particular smell of a cider that had gone to vinegar meant, which was different from the smell of a vinegar made on purpose. She knew which crocks were the important ones. On the 1st of September, she stood in the root cellar with her candle and looked at the 8 exceptional gallons and said, "When?" Clara said, "October." Wren said, "The fair." It was not a question. Clara looked at her for a moment and then said, "Yes, the fair." The Harwick County Harvest Fair was held the 3rd weekend of October, as it had been held for as long as anyone currently alive could remember. It was the primary social and commercial event of the county's agricultural year, the place where prices were set and reputations were made and grievances were aired with the thin cover of friendly competition, and where the cooperative's presence was so established and so central that Denton Marsh could usually be found at a table near the main gate with a price sheet and a ledger, and an expression of benevolent authority that conveyed to the farmers who came to him that what he was offering was the only reasonable option, and that any other path would be bumpy and lonely and probably end poorly. Clara applied for a vendor's table on the 2nd of September. The fair committee confirmed her spot by mail on the 15th. She said nothing about this to anyone except Wren, who received the information with her customary gravity and said, "How many bottles?" Clara had been calculating this since July. The 8 exceptional gallons bottled in quarts would yield 32 bottles. She had an additional 6 gallons from the midsummer pressing that had developed in a direction she thought of as very good, but not exceptional, which would yield 24 more bottles, 56 bottles total. She priced the exceptional ones at 65 cents a quart and the very good ones at 55. She spent 4 evenings in the first week of October making labels from cut paper and her best ink, and Wren, sitting across the table on the 3rd evening, watched her write and said, "They look serious." Clara said, "They should be." Wren said, "Can I write one?" Clara handed her the pen. The label Wren wrote was not the best one technically, but it was the one Clara put on the first bottle of the exceptional batch, and it was the one she set at the front of the display, and when people asked about it she said, "A young friend made that one," and left it at that. She arrived at the fairground on Saturday morning of the 3rd October weekend with her wagon loaded and her table set, and the bottles arranged with the methodical precision of someone who understood that presentation was its own form of argument. She had brought a small wooden sign painted with her name and the word cider in letters large enough to read from across the aisle. She did not bring claims or superlatives. She brought the cider. She set out 2 small cups for tasting on a square of clean linen. She folded her hands on the table, and she waited. The first hour was slow, as first hours at fairs tend to be. A few people stopped to look at the labels. A few read the price and made the face people make it something slightly more than they expected. 2 men who had tasted the cider at Hester Gun's store stopped and bought without tasting first, which was its own form of testimonial, and the fact of 2 men buying without tasting beside a table that offered free tastes drew the attention of the people who had walked past, which was how fairs worked and how Clara had known it would work. By the second hour there was a line. By the third hour she had sold 27 bottles. By early afternoon she had sold 44 and was being asked repeatedly if she had more in the wagon, which she did not, and was writing down names and addresses in her account book under the heading "Next Year," which was not a promise exactly, but was close to one. Denton Marsh saw the line from across the fairground at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. She knew this because she saw him see it, the double take, the stillness, the narrowing of the eyes that happened when a man who has organized his understanding of the world around a particular hierarchy encounters evidence that the hierarchy has been rearranged without his permission. He walked toward her table with the measured pace of a man who is trying to look as if he is strolling. He stood at the edge of the crowd and watched for several minutes. Then he came around to the side of the table where there was room and leaned toward her, with his false warmth deployed at full force, and said he had not realized she was bringing product to the fair this year, and what a fine display, and that given the volume she was doing today, he was prepared to make her a serious offer for next year's production, advance contract, guaranteed market, no risk on her end. He named the number 22 cents a gallon. This was even less than his July offer of 28, which meant either that his arithmetic had failed him or that he had decided she needed the security of a guaranteed buyer badly enough to take whatever he named. She looked at him. She said nothing for a moment, which she had found to be the response that cost him the most composure, and then she said, "What makes you think I'll have a gallon to spare next year?" He smiled the smile of a man who has information. He said, "Franklin Greer's trees came through the winter well, and there'll be a good crop of heritage fruit this autumn. And when the weather turns on a crop like that, it tends to turn hard. So a woman in your position might want to think about her supply." She looked at him. She said, "And what position is that?" He said, "Well, alone, with a property to manage, it's a great deal of work for one person." She said nothing. She let the silence sit there like a stone on muslin, weighting things down. And she watched him begin to recognize from the outside what she already knew from the inside, which was that the silence was its own reply and that it was not a frightened one. He said then, "I know you've had a good day. I know those 32 quarts of the top batch went for 65 cents. She stopped. She had told no one, not a single person, what her pricing was before she arrived at the fair. She had written it in her account book and set the labels in her kitchen and told Wren, and that was the full extent of the information's distribution. The 32 bottles of the exceptional batch at 65 cents was a figure that existed in one place outside her own memory, which was her account book, which was on her property, which she had locked before she left that morning. And Denton Marsh had just said 32 quarts. He had not said approximately 30 or about 35. He had said 32. She looked at him with an expression that she had not planned, and that she felt settle into her face from somewhere very still and very certain. And she said, "How do you know how many bottles I brought?" He opened his mouth. He closed it. The warmth drained out of his expression the way water drains from a cracked vessel, all at once and irreversibly. And what was underneath it was not rage and not shame, but something between them, the particular expression of a man who has just explained himself with a number he should not have known, and who understands, in the moment of saying it, exactly what he has done. The people nearest the table had heard. This was a fair. People at fairs hear things, and what they heard was the number 32, and the question that followed it, and the silence that followed that. There was a woman named Ruth Paisley, 2 places back in the line, who had been canning with Clara Vesper's mother before Clara was born, and who was not slow, and whose face at that moment showed the arithmetic arriving in real time, and who said out loud, to no one in particular, "Well now." That was all she said. But she said it in a tone that carried. Clara let the silence hold for one more moment. Then she said to Denton Marsh, directly and without bitterness, what she had been carrying the shape of since November. "I'll sell to the county at a fair price. Not your price, not a charity price, a fair price. If you want to buy what I make next year, at 40 cents a gallon for the Standard and 60 for the Select, you can come to my property and put your name in my account book, and I will hold your allotment. If that's not a number you can work with, there are farmers in this county who will press their own next season, and I will help them do it. And there will be cider in Harwick County that doesn't need your margin in the middle of it." She paused. She said, "The arithmetic is simple enough." He said nothing. She turned back to the line which was still there, waiting with the patient faith of people who have decided what they want. He did not leave immediately. He stood for a moment longer, and in that moment Clara did not watch him, which was a cruelty so precise and so unpretentious that it was not cruelty at all, but only its own form of accuracy. Then he walked back across the fairground in the direction of his table near the main gate, and she did not watch him go, and neither did she need to. She sold the last 12 bottles in the following hour. When the table was empty, she folded the linen square and put it in her basket and counted the money, which was the kind of counting that takes a steady hand, not because the numbers are complex, but because some numbers are a long time coming. 32 bottles of the exceptional at 65 cents came to $20.80. 24 bottles of the very good at 55 cents came to $13.20. Total, $34. From a $4 cart of hail split apples that no one else had wanted. She wrote this in her account book sitting at the empty table as the fair moved around her, and she wrote it in the same hand as everything else, which was level and unadorned, and she sat for a moment looking at it before she closed the book. Wren appeared from somewhere in the crowd and climbed up onto the edge of the wagon bed and said, "Is it done?" Clara said, "For today." Wren said, "Did he come?" Clara said, "He came." Wren said, "And?" Clara said, "And he said too much." Wren thought about this and appeared to understand it in the way she understood most things, which was completely and without requiring elaboration. She said, "Will you press next year?" Clara said, "Yes." Wren said, "Can I help?" Clara said, "I was counting on it." She went to see Aldous Piet the following Monday morning, which was the kind of morning that October produces in that county when it is feeling generous, cold and bright, and smelling of wood smoke and the last of the fallen apples composting in the grass, a smell that was both an ending and a beginning, depending on your disposition. He was at his hives again, in his coat now, the bees slower in the cold but still purposeful, still making their own arithmetic of flowers and distance and return. She told him what had happened at the fair. He listened without expression until she was done. He said, "And Marsh." She said he had made himself known in a way he had not intended to. Aldous Piet looked at the hives. He said, "A man who knows your number, but will not say how he knows it, is a man who has already spent what he does not own." She said that seemed right. He said, "And next season." She said she was planning to offer Franklin Greer a fair price for a share of his heritage fruit before the season opened, so that she had a supply she could count on, and she would share the press work with 2 or 3 other farms on the bottomland who had wanted to try their own cider but did not have the equipment or the experience. He nodded. He said, "The broken ones always carry the most." She said, "Yes." He looked at her with something that was not sentiment, and was not pity, and was closer to recognition, the look of one person who understands the long way round acknowledging another. She went home and began writing letters. Franklin Greer agreed by December to reserve a portion of his heritage crop for her at a price they both found honest, which was 78 cents a bushel for clean fruit and 40 for the split and bruised, which was 11 times $4 and considerably more equitable for both of them than anything Denton Marsh's cooperative had offered either of them in recent years. 2 families on the bottomland, the Adlers and a young couple named Corbin, who had recently taken on the old Fenwick place, came to her property in January to learn the process, and she showed them the account book pages from the previous year. The numbers laid out plainly, the $4 at the top and the $34 at the bottom, and she showed them the production notes and the timing notes and the notation that said, "Do not rush these." And she told them the same thing she had concluded herself, which was that the work was patient and unglamorous, and that the results rewarded patience more than they rewarded speed or volume or noise. By the following October, there were 4 presses working on the bottomland, and the Harwick County Fair had 3 cider vendors, and Denton Marsh was not among those setting the price for their product. He had come to Clara in February, as she had said he could, and he had put his name in her account book at 40 cents a gallon for standard and 60 for select, which were the numbers she had named at the fair, and the transaction had the particular quality of a correction made without ceremony, the clean closing of an account that had been out of balance. She had treated him throughout as she would have treated any buyer, which was with the plain-spoken accuracy she applied to everything. He received this without gratitude, but he received it, which was sufficient. Wren turned 11 that spring, and she pressed her own first solo batch from a half-bushel of windfalls she collected from Franklin Greer's orchard floor on a Saturday afternoon and brought to Clara's barn in a burlap sack on her back. She pressed it alone and labeled the bottles herself and sold them at the fair for 30 cents each, and was the most serious 11-year-old at the fair by some margin. She gave Clara 1 bottle and Aldous Piet 1 bottle, and kept the rest, and put the money in a tin on a shelf above her bed, which was the beginning of an account book she had not yet written out, but was already running in her head. Aldous Piet came to the fair on the last day, as he sometimes did, not to buy and not to sell, but to observe, and he stood for a while at the edge of Clara's table, watching the county come and go and taste and buy, and Clara watched him watching them. And after a time he said, without turning his head, "You are not alone now." She looked at the 2 other tables with their ciders and their labels, and at Wren counting change at the end of the row, and at Ruth Paisley stopping to tell someone else to try the select, and "Don't bother with anything else," and at Franklin Greer arriving at the end of the day to check on the fruit he had grown and the cider it had become. And she said, "No." She said, "I suppose I am not." He said, "One person alone is only the beginning of the story." She said, "Yes." He looked at the hives in his mind, she thought, the way he always did. He said, "The broken ones always carry the most." She said, "I know." It was the 3rd time he had said it to her, or perhaps the 4th, and each time it had meant the same thing and something additional, a truth that was also growing, a wound that was also a seam through which something warm and useful had entered the world and was now, at last, circulating through it freely. The accounts of her life, she thought, were finally and honestly balanced, not closed, not resolved to stillness, but balanced the way a working farm is balanced, by effort, by attention, by the small perpetual arithmetic of things given and returned, and by the patience of a woman who had paid $4 for a cart of broken fruit, and understood, before anyone else, exactly what she was buying.